Hi, folks. Welcome to our weekly discussion of local history, our local history chats, as I like to call them. And congratulations on getting through what was an incredible snowy week last week. If you're watching live or in the next couple days, we're probably going to come into the January thaw. But last week was pretty tough. Um, East Aurora didn't actually get hit the hardest of our south towns, but the typical lake effect snow. And we've been digging out, and we're going to get the thaw this week, so we'll see what happens. But I saw on social media, as I do, and a lot of you probably do as well, and talking to people every time there's a big snowstorm like we had last week, and it was pretty significant when you look at the history of snowstorms. When you start talking about feet of snow and the blowing and the wind, that tends to be significant. And we don't know, since we've lived through two big November storms in the past decade. Um, we're sometimes immune to some of these snowstorms that don't seem as bad as 8, 9 feet, but actually 1 to 2 feet of snow is pretty significant. And when it's blowing heavy winds, that's also uh, that makes it a big storm. So last week was significant, even though it may not feel like that compared to the storms of even last year, the blizzards that we had, the Christmas blizzard and the November storm last year. But it was significant when you look back at the history of snowstorms in our area. But when we get these storms, I often see on Facebook or social media or hear from people that, especially when schools close, you get some of those naysayers out there, the critics who say, "Oh, why does we're just so wimpy today. Why school closed? We can't get the streets clear." Um, or back when we were young, or back in the day, people they would never close school, and we're closing school all the time today. And so that got me to thinking, and I've thought about this through the past couple storms, is do we really, are we wimpier today when it comes to the snow and the snowstorms? And do we cancel things much more quickly today than they would have in the past? You often hear that old adage of old people who said that they walked to school uphill in both directions in snowstorms several feet deep. Um, and we're just wimpy today. The generation and the kids today just don't know what getting to school in a true snowstorm means, and they're soft. That the people of our grandparents or great grandparents generation were just harder and tougher when it came to snowstorms. Sorry to bust the bubble and to throw water on this. Dampen this local legend, and not just local, but wherever you go in snow country, you'll hear it. But it is not necessarily true that we cancel things much more often today than they did back in the quote unquote good old days. I took a look through the old newspaper archives, and I've done a lot of research in the past about snowstorms, the big ones. There was a big one in 1900, a November storm. I wrote about that, um, and actually one in 1936 that we got a lot of snow, and it was a late season storm. We got a lot of snow, and then it all melted, causing flooding throughout the village here in East Aurora. So I've studied those, and so that's what intrigued me, because every time that those storms came along, the big ones, they would close school. Uh, and so I went back and looked um, in the past of not necessarily the big storms, but your sort of ones like we had last week, not necessarily ones that flooded or shut everything down, but just other storms that came along in the winter time. And I noticed that they close school probably just as often as we close school today. Now there is a an argument um, that we do close school more often today than we have maybe in the 80s or the 70s. And the New York Times actually did a great article. If you search in the New York Times search, or even just Google it, I think I found it, is a couple years ago. The mayor of New York was criticized for closing school so much. And they actually asked the question, do we close school more often today than we have? And there is no database. Actually, they said that there's no database of closing days, but they went back and looked at the newspaper records, and they did some research to try to figure out, do we close school more often? And yes, they found that in many places, not just New York City, but cities out west, in the plains, that they picked a couple locales that they do close more often. There were some bigger storms though in the period of time more recently. But there are more days that we may close school, and I think that happens here locally as well. However, this idea that the kids of yesteryear, of our grandparents or great grandparents' generation, trudged through snow that we wouldn't today, is just, there's no basis in the record, in the historical record, that that's actually true. So just I'm just looking at my notes here, and I'm going to write about this. I probably, the window's closing on, hopefully spring's coming soon. Maybe next year I'll write about it, for my monthly newspaper column, but and be able to delve more deeply in the numbers and the record, and maybe try to find some more solid numbers as to the number of days closed. But anecdotally, just going through the newspaper real quickly, doing digital search of the local Easter Advertiser, December 1950, there was close to a foot of snow here in East Aurora, and schools closed for 2 days, Thursday and Friday. So less snow than we've had during storms, and they've closed for 2 days, December 1950. November 1957, schools closed early on one day and closed for the entire day the next day. East Aurora and other areas schools, um, for about 1.5 to 2 feet in the rural areas, not in the village. There's even less snow in the village. So they closed for 2 days in November of 1957. January 1969, schools were closed for deep snow, a couple days. December 1962, 28 inches fell, and that was also outside the village. The village got less, and schools closed for at least one day. Um, there's a big storm, and actually, well, in 1900 there was actually a big November storm, um, uh, and we were just under. This whole area was under a lot of snow. There were actually several feet of snow, and I had written about that. The history of November storms. Closed. Kids were not trudging through the snow to get. They weren't tough and trudged through. They closed the schools. Um, but one interesting year, and it was a tough year, and we see the weather do this, where we'll have a couple years in a row of bad weather, and then a couple years of uh, just the exact opposite. It goes up and down. And I feel like we're in that now. Like last year, we had some big storms. This year, because of the lake effect, we had early warm weather, and we're paying for it now. That phenomena is not new. Lake effect snow, even though they didn't call it that back in the day, um, it was lake effect snow, and they got hit here in East Aurora, the north towns, or we'd get hit here in East Aurora, and Holland would see hardly any snow at all. Same concept, and that was happening. The lakes have always been there, or at least since the glaciers. So that phenomena isn't new. So this would happen a lot. The lake effect snow here in our area. A really bad winter was 1944 to 1945. And actually, there was a storm. We got hit with a 1-2 punch. There was one in December. Um, and actually, schools closed for 2 days in that December period, just before a couple weeks before Christmas. Some schools, local schools, closed for 3 days. And then actually, this was during, and I find this funny because the resiliency, you think of when people might have been tougher than us, and of any period of time, it would have been World War II, right? Well, this was in the thick of World War II, 1944 to 1945. So schools closed that December, but also Curtis Wright, Bell Factory, a lot of the wartime factories in Buffalo closed. So people didn't report to work. The trains were blocked, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Why the trains were important, but we were closed, and people did not risk their lives, or weren't tougher than us. They realized that they couldn't get someplace and it wasn't safe to get someplace. They actually talk about safety in the newspaper in the 1940s. So I would argue that in that instance, similar kind of storm that we've had, people were just as cautious about going out in the weather. And I think that's good. That this idea that they were tougher than us, I don't think is necessarily true. Within a month, in January 1945, there was another storm, and schools were closed yet again. And the first week of January 1945, the schools actually closed for 3 days in a row after they had already been closed in December. So Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of that week, the schools around here were closed for 3 days in a row. It makes a big difference, of course. Like last week's storm came during Martin Luther King Day week, so actually that one day might have been closed anyway, but it was a long weekend. That tended to happen too. So the 3 days might have been 2 days if the storm was over a weekend. But the point being that schools closed for storms. This idea in our head that we have that they would tough it out and get to school uphill in both directions, right? No, that just it just doesn't have any basis in the historical record. There was also some interesting things that I noticed, and again, I'll write about this coming up with a little more detail. But I noticed they used the term, and I was kind of blown away in 1942. In December of 1942, there was a storm, and the newspaper actually used the term travel advisory. They actually, the police and law enforcement and local officials actually used the term travel advisory and said they encouraged all motorists to, quote, curtail all unnecessary travel. Sounds a little like we hear today on the news when there's a storm coming. So they were using those same terms, trying to get people to stay home. People weren't tough and going out into the storm. People weren't sending their kids out into the storm. So that idea we have that we hear often that people were tougher during snowstorms, um, it just isn't true. Another thing I found, not related necessarily to the weather, is other times that we've closed businesses or schools. And actually, in 1950, there was a coal shortage. They actually called it a crisis, and we heated schools and other buildings with coal. And they closed the schools because they were too cold, and they were afraid they were going to run out of coal by the end of the season. So they closed the school. And this happened quite a bit too. The one-room schoolhouses, they would close down the schools because it's too cold. They didn't want to either send the kids out in the cold, or they couldn't keep the school warm enough, or they were afraid that if they used up their resources in the height of the winter, that they would run out by the end of the season. So they canceled school. So when you hear today that that they didn't cancel school for those kinds of reasons, back in the good old days they would tough it out. No, they did. If school was too cold, they would close. Also with illnesses, there was of course, 1918 Spanish flu. Schools closed during that, but throughout history, there would be 1951 is a good example. February 1951, I found that they actually closed school. So many people were sick with influenza, the flu that year, that and we've had this happen recently in schools where there's been illness and there's just been so many illnesses that they just closed for a few days. They did that in 1952, and actually, George Washington's birthday was that Monday. So the previous week, there were so many kids getting sick and teachers getting sick, and they didn't have enough teachers to teach, and they didn't have substitutes in the one-room schoolhouses. So they just closed, and the main school here in East Aurora on Main Street, so they closed. And they took it through Washington's birthday in order to try to get people healthier again and not be spreading the influenza around. So they didn't toughen it out. They were smart, and they closed the schools, much like we've seen in some recent years where there's been heightened illness, and from time to time they'll close the schools. So I found that interesting that um, they did very similar things to deal with similar issues that we would today. Um, be it with the snow, be it with the cold, be it with illness. Uh, there's very similar reactions and smart moves by school officials to do that. Now, you could argue that they take it too far today, but for the most part, it's very similar. There was an interesting article in 1923 talking about it was a syndicated article that the Easter Advertiser published about I think it was 23. It was in the 1920s, regardless. Um, about schools closing for trivial reasons, and it wasn't East Aurora schools or our area schools, but there was these one-room schoolhouses and smaller schools where the school, if the principal had something to do, had an appointment, they or the teacher, they would just close school. And there was this argument that you have to be there. The schools have to be open for the students on a regular schedule, and I found that interesting too. That we had talked about teachers not being able to get into school from other areas that may have had travel bans or issues. That similar thing happened 100 years ago, where teachers had things to do and they didn't have any enough substitutes to replace them. And actually, in 1900, I often hear some people talk about the number of staff development days or superintendent's days that are put into the calendar. These aren't new either. There's several mentions, but one in particular I found from 1900, where the schools in the town of Wales were closed because the teachers, and presumably other places, because there was this institute, this training in Hamburg that the teachers needed to attend for their week, and they closed the schools. So they would call that a staff development day today, and the kids would stay home, the students would stay home, and the teachers had their staff development. So that was in 1900. So we had days off for that as well. So very similar things happening um, today. So this argument that somehow we're not as tough as our predecessors, yes, we might be more cautious. One thing we have today is much better technology at predicting the weather. So that's one difference. I noticed sometimes the big storms, students would come home from school in really bad storms and try to get to either the train or to get home, um, because we didn't have the technology to predict the weather. So today we have a lot, we know what's coming. Even though sometimes we yell at the meteorologists for not being right, our technology is much, much better than it was even 50 years ago. So how we call snow days, how we cancel things, I noticed some stores on Main Street last week were posting on their Facebook pages in anticipation of the storm. Well, because we have the technology to tell us something's coming. We have meteorologists, we have radar, we know what's coming. But back in the day, they would cancel, but for 1950, 1900, they would cancel after the storm hit. There wasn't that as accurate of weather forecast, plus the technology to communicate it to everybody. So a lot of times, yes, they would be tougher to get through the snow once they were stuck in it, but they still canceled school and they still canceled, businesses didn't open. I had been talking to an older friend of mine who I refer to quite a bit, and I had asked about these storms, and she said that yeah, school wasn't necessarily canceled. You just didn't go. They wouldn't, if the weather was really bad and you were stuck at your house. Mind you, there wasn't, we didn't plow the streets as much as we do today. So there wasn't a way to get there necessarily to school. You just wouldn't go. So it didn't matter if school was open or closed. You just didn't, as one singular student or one family, wouldn't go. So that makes a huge difference. Um, and today we travel differently. We're in cars. We have buses. School buses weren't a thing back at the early 1900s. Students would take either a train, which could get through snow a little bit easier. You clear one track rather than all the roads for people to drive on. And plus, the students tended to come with the neighborhood schools, come from a smaller neighborhood. So they could maybe get there a little easier. If you're in the village here, you could walk to the school. You didn't have kids from West Falls necessarily coming all the way down to the village of East Aurora to go to school. So it was just a little different. And the trains could take students, high school students from West Falls to Orchard Park. That's where they would go to high school. And say South Wales and points beyond to the East Aurora School on the train. And trains did get blocked, but it clearing the track wasn't as hard as clearing necessarily all the roads during a big snowstorm. But it did happen. So if the trains were stuck, you didn't get to work and you didn't get to school. So that did happen. So again, this idea that we're not as tough as our forefathers and our foremothers when it comes to snow, and that we cancel things much more often, I don't believe it. Uh, we seem to be smarter with the weather. Maybe we're a little bit more cautious, but they canceled school and closed stores and closed things in bad weather just like we do today. So again, it's one of those folklore stories that's been told over the years that the previous generation was tougher than the one now, and it's just not necessarily true. So again, thank you for talking about these ideas. It's great to hear from you, and I tend to come up with ideas through conversations that I hear from people, and this was one of them. And again, I will be. The weather seems to be such a great conversation starter as always, and the history of weather too is very interesting. I actually had a request this week for a interview for a documentary related to buffalo weather. So people are talking about it. It's very interesting. Again, keep your comments coming. I really appreciate all the feedback. Little by little, more and more people are subscribing and liking the page. Again, I am Rob Goller. I am the town and village historian, but all my videos here do not reflect my official duties as town and village historian. That's just my little disclaimer, as always. And again, these videos are also available, in addition to being available on the Facebook page, they're available on YouTube under Robert Lowell Goller. So if you enjoy what you're hearing, feel free to subscribe, share everything you need to do to spread the word. I really appreciate the support of this project. Again, thanks for joining me, and thank you for keeping history alive, and we'll see you next time.